Hey, Anu, hi.
Hi, Akash. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining this. Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining this talk. I'm really happy to be here with Anu Bradford. We've only met on email before, so this is a first for us as well. She is a professor of law and international organization at Columbia Law School. She's an international expert on EU law, trade law, and increasingly, many of you probably know her through her work on cyber law, digital law, and the geopolitics of tech law and policy, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So I first came across Anu's work with her earlier book called The Brussels Effect: How the European Union Rules the World. Maybe that's how many of you discovered her as well, because the title of that book, The Brussels Effect, has effectively become a neologism. I had to check the pronunciation of that word, by the way, for those of you who don't know it. But anyway, it's a neologism. It's become a way of referring to a broad effect. And the book was basically about, it wasn't just about tech, it was a wide range of sectors and how in ways that aren't always recognized, the EU is basically dominating global economic regulation. So the most recent book came out last year in August. It's called Digital Empires: The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. It picks up in many ways from the last book. It's more specifically focused on the Brussels effect in technology in particular. And also she widens the geographic terrain. So she's not just talking about the EU, she's talking about China and the US as well, and how these three kind of models coexist on the landscape of geopolitical tech policy. So just to summarize her argument, I'm going to quote very quickly a brief passage from the book. Here's the quote. Today, there are three dominant digital powers: the US, China, and the EU, who can metaphorically be thought of as digital empires. These modern empires of the internet era are the leading technology, economic, and regulatory powers, each with the ambition and capability to shape the global digital order toward their interests and values. Each digital empire holds a different vision for the digital economy, which is reflected in the regulatory models they have adopted. These three leading regulatory models could be thought of as representing three varieties of digital capitalism. The US has pioneered a largely market-driven model, China a state-driven model, and the EU a rights-driven model. So just to say, I actually wrote about this book earlier this year in an essay on internet governance in the New Yorker. And I have to say that writing about tech regulation and governance for the New Yorker was a highly challenging prospect, something I wanted to do for a long time, but it just felt dry and kind of arcane and not conducive to storytelling. And Anu's framing of this in a kind of empire way made the topic a lot juicier. It felt like one of the, like a sort of update on, like a history of the East India Company, or one of those kind of old East sort of imperial battles. And so thank you for that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to write about this, something I'd wanted to write about for a long time. Um, so okay, the format here is we're gonna take I'm gonna talk to Anu. I have a few questions for her, 35 minutes or so, and then we're gonna lead into questions from you in the audience. And please put your questions in the Slido chat box next to your YouTube screen. You also might have heard in the intro there is a button to buy the book, and I would recommend doing that. It's a great read, very informative and very interesting. So let's kick off here. Um, Anu, I guess I wanted to start by asking you about how this book grew out of the last one. I mean, the last book was pretty broad, and we were looking at kind of the general effect across sectors. How did you end up deciding to focus on tech in particular? Was it a sense that sort of the Brussels effect was strongest in the tech space? Was it a domain that interested you in particular? How did you end up there?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Akash, so much for that great summary of the key arguments and your really thoughtful engagement with the book in the New Yorker. So it's just wonderful to be in conversation with you. And ultimately, that's why I write. I write not to have the final word. I don't think anybody can have a final word on how should we think about the modes of regulation and the geopolitics of digital economy, but it's really for the sake of having conversations like the ones we have today. So how did I start working on the digital empires? It did grow out of the Brussels effect and the various, again, conversations that I was having when discussing the book. And I just noticed that even though the Brussels effect really touched on many domains, whether we talk about chemical safety, consumer protection, we think about, well, antitrust and digital economy, but sort of environmental law, other domains, everybody wanted to talk about digital. That seemed to be the one that where the world was moving, where some of the most exciting and difficult questions on governance came about. So I just noticed that I found myself being constantly in the conversation about the general data protection regulation or how the EU goes about hate speech. And then also when I was getting questions from Americans really reflecting from their own point of view the EU's regulatory choices. That led me then to this desire to do more of a comparative book, where I would look at what the EU does, but set it in the context of how it differs from how other key players are operating in the marketplace and thinking about tech regulation. So that was probably the early motivation, but it's really just more broadly a desire to be part of sort of academic discussions that are affecting individuals around the world every day. And I can't really think of another domain where all of us have a stake in this debate. So how the digital societies evolve will be so determinant of the kind of lives that we all are leading. And that was, I think, ultimately the central motivation for writing the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I first started working in tech policy 20 some years ago, it felt so arcane and like such a sideshow to the main sort of currents of life. And I tell everybody what you just said, that it's gotten so much more interesting because now it is life, right? And like virtually every kind of major debate runs through tech policy. So yeah, I agree that that is sort of affecting everybody. Um, I'm trying to think through the sort of mix of motivations and impulses that drives these projections of empire. And I was thinking about this last night. There's a mix of kind of defensive and offensive kind of motivations by the respective empires. There's a view that like when China first starts talking about cyber sovereignty or whatever, whether that's in 2010 or even earlier, it's really a kind of defensive move against the US and what's seen as sort of like US sort of offense onto its territory. But then at some point it gets kind of hegemonic and outward looking when they're talking about digital Silk Road and Belt and Road Initiative. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the mix of motivations that's driving these empires and maybe how it differs also by these three sort of jurisdictions.
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely right that there's a set of internal motivations and external motivations. So part of that, if you think about how the Chinese state-driven model works, how they're very focused on making China a technological superpower, which helps China deliver growth locally, sort of domestically, and hence then earn the legitimacy for the ruling Communist Party. But also it has more of an external ambition to make sure that China fares well in the global economic and geopolitical rivalry. But if you also think about then the surveillance, censorship, propaganda, the kind of political aspect that is characteristic to the Chinese model, that has a very strong domestic component. Ultimately, China is very focused on controlling dissent domestically, ensuring social stability domestically. But as you say, that has evolved over the years when demand for same kind of governance has grown all over the world. And China is willingly responding to that demand by exporting these surveillance technologies along the digital Silk Road that then reaches across Africa, Latin America, Asia, even parts of Europe. So there is more of an internal and external motive, both of which are part of that model. The same way with the EU, I've often described the Brussels effect as having a very internal EU foundation. The EU didn't start regulating in order to rule the world. The EU was very focused on completing the single European market and getting rid of the differentials in regulation across the member states so that you can trade more smoothly within the EU and then integrate that European marketplace. But then over time, the EU realized that its laws were having this external effect due to this phenomenon that I've called the Brussels effect. So if I just quickly, because everybody probably hasn't read the Brussels effect, in 1 minute summarize what I mean by that. Sorry. What I mean by that is the idea that the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets around the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, these companies need to follow European regulations. But often it is in their interest to extend that European regulation across the global marketplace because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory frameworks. So simply by regulating the single market, the EU is able to extend its regulatory reach across the global marketplace when the companies are following their business instinct and then adopting the EU rule across their global production and global services. So this is what the EU then came to realize, that even though the initial motivation was more the intra-EU integration, it found itself suddenly in a position to influencing what goods are and services are produced and offered globally. So that was the kind of regulatory power that was also a way to export the European way of life, the European values that are embedded in those European regulations. And the EU is now more self-consciously thinking about regulation as a tool for the governance within the EU, but also as a tool for shaping the global marketplace. So if you think about then the US very briefly, the US has been very focused on making sure that America is defined by its commitment to freedom, the free market and free internet and free speech and incentives to innovate. But it has also been very keen to export those internet freedoms across the world in the way of then exporting this American way of thinking about what an ideal free society looks like and extending that to the rest of the world. So that's how I came up with this terminology of empires, knowing that empires, it's a big word, it's a controversial word, and I use it to some extent metaphorically. But I think it does capture this idea that none of these regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, they really are shaping the broader global marketplace when the empires are extending their relative spheres of influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that just came up in your answer now, and that you do so well in your book, is you show that though this isn't, just about regulating tech or even about regulating marketplaces, right? It's not just about commercial interest or tech policy. It's really a kind of values thing, and it's about spreading a country's sort of way of life or values. You had a quote in your book that really struck me. I think it's Jack Goldsmith who says that the EU started seeing US big tech as a threat to its way of life or something like that. So I guess my question is, like, in projecting this tech policy or this tech regulation around the world, I mean, there's a lot more going on here than tech policy. This is geopolitics by other means. Is this kind of the primary arena in a way for geopolitics now? Is it up there with, like, national security and defense policy, basically?
So absolutely. I think these days it's very difficult to separate any conversations around technology from conversations on national security, because technology is so central to countries' geopolitical leverage and military capabilities. So if you think about, for instance, artificial intelligence, or many of those technology-driven developments where we produce dual goods, where there is a commercial application, but also then a military application. And that's why issues like who is leading the AI race is so central, because that is not just the gateway for economic prosperity, but it is also then shaping the distribution of geopolitical power around the world. And it's contributing directly to the military capabilities. So that's why we're very much seeing now or fighting this battle over economic security and national security in the tech war. That's why we have the trade and tech war between the US and China that is so fundamentally shaping the technological ecosystem. And in many ways, Akash, it's very interesting how that has also affecting these models that I'm outlining. Because if you look at what the US is doing right now, it's pursuing export controls and investment restrictions and flooding the market with subsidies in order to boost its technological capabilities while restricting China's access to those capabilities. That is no longer techno-libertarianism or free market in its purest form. In many ways, the US is playing Beijing's game and moving closer to the state-driven model. The same way, if you think about the EU is very focused on retaining or regaining its digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, as it's trying to navigate the complicated tech environment and avoid being at the mercy of its dependencies from the US and China. So in many ways, both the US and the EU are now moving, given the geopolitical dynamic, towards some degree or different variation of the state-driven model.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you about digital sovereignty, because that's something that we think about and that I write about at New America. And I guess, when I first started working here with New America and thinking about digital sovereignty, I had a very kind of Xi Jinping Chinese view of digital sovereignty, which is this is an authoritarian kind of idea, and it's what authoritarian states project. And then the more I've gotten into it, I'm seeing, as you just said, that in many ways, so-called liberal democracies like the EU and to some extent the US, certainly the EU, are talking about internet sovereignty and digital sovereignty now. So yeah, I guess the question is, first of all, do you see this digital empires? Is this a form of digital sovereignty, or how do you understand the notion of digital sovereignty? And is digital sovereignty a kind of authoritarian concept that is now being adopted by liberal democracies as well?
So it's a really interesting question, because it seems to be that there's almost like a global pursuit of greater digital sovereignty. And at the same time, we could say that's a rather futile pursuit, because it's very difficult to imagine any nation being truly digitally sovereign. That's why we're not seeing full decoupling of the tech ecosystems into a Chinese and American and European spheres of influence. Those overlaps continue to be there because of the economic dependencies. So if you think about semiconductors, one of the main frontiers of this geopolitical tech battle, there's no country, no jurisdiction that can basically reshore every aspect of the complicated and costly semiconductor supply chain to their domestic markets. So there's this desire to be a more sovereign, but also I think, Akash, it's important that every nation attaches somewhat different meaning for that. So when we talk about digital sovereignty, technological autonomy in the US and the EU, it is not the desire to become authoritarian. So the way China thinks about in defensive sense of its technological sovereignty and the choices it makes around entrenching that digital authoritarian model, the motivations don't necessarily overlap fully. The same way Brazil is now asserting its digital sovereignty by basically having this very big showdown with Elon Musk and X and saying that, look, you don't play by our rules, you are not respecting our sovereignty, so we are not letting you operate in the country. That is a very radical way of exercising the sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Some make the comparison then to say that, look, now Brazil is acting like China. Also, China is keeping these companies out of its market. And both could say that, look, we just want these companies to play by our rules. And China could say that, look, they don't respect our domestic rules around censorship and around other commitments that they would have vis-a-vis the government. But I still would draw the distinction that the understanding of the concept of digital sovereignty is to some extent jurisdiction specific. And there are different, I would say, variants of that. But there is almost like a global push when every country feels less confident that they can and should rely on international supply chains. International cooperation, the trust among countries is very low at this stage. So we are seeing the countries retreating to some extent, trying to shed their dependencies and build their own capabilities, which leads to these subsidy wars, which leads to greater techno-nationalism and techno-protectionism. So there certainly is a global effect, even if the precise motivations would be somewhat different across the countries.
Yeah, it's hard to think about these issues or talk about these issues without raising the prospect of splinternet. The sort of balkanization of the internet and the breakup of this, like for all its problems, still remains this amazing global kind of commons or global public good. And for years, like the sort of take on the splinternet was, well, it might happen at the level of like content or like applications, but the underlying data flows will remain intact, and it's in nobody's interest. Do you take solace in that vision, or do you think we're headed in a direction where there's going to be real splinternet if this goes on?
So I generally think that we are not going to see either extreme. I'm afraid there's no going back to this borderless internet and or the idea if we ever fully had that. I think China had the firewall built from the onset of the internet revolution. We've never had a fully global internet in that sense. But at the same time, there's been ways to sort of ensure that elements of the digital economy have remained global. So, for instance, you mentioned data flows. Up until recently, many countries still subscribe to this notion that data is important to let move across the borders. The US was a big proponent of not imposing restrictions on data. But now even the US is retreating, and countries are moving more towards data localization requirements. So that's an element where, if you think about this continuum of policies that would require full data localization and others where data moves entirely free of any restrictions, we are not going to go to either extreme, but in that continuum, we are clearly moving towards greater set of restrictions that are forcing companies to pursue data localization or making it costly and harder for them to move data across the continent. So we're seeing this, I would say, alternation between the measures towards escalation of the tech war and restrictions and de-escalation, because the commercial realities are still setting constraints to all the players who cannot fully afford to forego the benefits of a global digital economy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk a lot to policymakers, and I'm wondering, like, when you do, what is their sense of commitment to the idea of a global internet? You know, is it sort of like, for example, in the EU, is it like privacy and kind of consumer rights first, and if we need to strike these sort of digital solidarity type agreements with like-minded nations but cut off others, that's fine? Or is there a commitment to a global internet there?
So I think, unfortunately, the commitment to globalization writ large is waning to some extent. I think if you look at how the key institutions like the WTO is really struggling to promote this notion that we need enforceable global rules and that the benefits of economic integration are just too important for countries to forego, we don't really see that commitment there. So there's a lot of kind of nativist populist parties that are gaining increasing prominence across the world. The geopolitical tensions are elevated to the level that I just think progress in international fora is diminishing. And the countries are at best sort of hedging they partnerships. They try to build alliances with like-minded countries that they still believe that they can trust and work with. But even there we see challenges. So even if you think about the US and the EU aligning their views in some domains, we also see big regulatory battles between the two. So even though both could be said to be committed to democracy, free speech, fundamental rights, but when you start asking about how do we trade off our commitment to national security and surveillance and individuals' right to privacy, we don't see the two necessarily to share the view. So to some extent, we see, if you think about the technological world, the kind of decoupling whereby the group of techno-democracies are trying to find deeper ways to engage with one another. And then that China is emerging as a leader of the group of techno-autocracies, if you like. So there's to some extent the kind of bifurcated value-based division. But I would also not want to overstate that, because the boundaries are not exactly clear. There are many countries that are straddling these two worlds and are not willing to fully align with China, nor are they fully willing to just disengage China, even if the United States would encourage them to do that. So it's messier, it's more complicated. But certainly, if you try to find trends, I would say we see less of a commitment to genuine globalization. We see the rise of nationalism and protectionism. And we see this kind of friendshoring and collaboration with countries that are seen as sharing a set of values.
Yeah, I love that response, because it sets it as, this is not just about tech policy. You're setting it within a kind of broader ideological retreat and just sort of like political trends around the world, a kind of end of history moment. And again, I just think that your book does that so well. You know, there's so much tech writing is like just about tech, right? But setting it within the sort of broader context is what you do so well. You talked about the other countries that don't fall clearly, you know, into one of these three empires. And as you know, like you and I have emailed about this, and I've thought about the role, for example, when I wrote about your book, I wrote about India and digital public infrastructure as a potentially fourth model. But beyond that, like I would love to know more how you're thinking about other countries and especially maybe these so-called geopolitical swing states. So, you know, countries like Brazil or maybe the UAE or India that are big, that have some of that same market size and market heft that have enabled the EU to project its weight around the world. How do you see these countries fitting into this chessboard that you're laying out?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. I think there's a set of countries that are more closely assigned with one of the three digital empires. So the techno democracies, if you think about which countries are generally thought to fall within that group, we talk about Canada and Australia, New Zealand and Japan and South Korea, where they are largely emulating a variant of the European rights-driven model. But if you look more closely, some of them are kind of between the empires. So Japan, for instance, has often followed, almost copying the words of the European regulations, but they are very comfortable with voluntary rules. So non-binding codes, which is then an element that is more associated with the American market-driven model. So I would place Japan somewhere between the two. India to me is fascinating. And in many ways, I think if I had decided to sit on the book and work more on that, there would have been more on India. But in many ways, I think my desire was, like I said, I don't need to say the final word, but really advance the conversation. And one thing that I've been really just been so delighted to observe that there's now a robust conversation of India's digital public infrastructure, a conversation of whether it is a fourth empire and what kind of global role India would have. So because India also doesn't fully neatly fit into one of these categories. So I think India has many elements of the rights-driven model. If you look at the way India is approaching in many of the bills to regulate privacy, there are elements and echoes of the GDPR for sure. If you look at some of the antitrust cases, competition law cases that India is bringing, it is prepared to regulate tech with a rather heavy hand. It's banning on many Chinese apps. That's pretty much of I think a shared feature with the European Union's view that you need to have the government step in to advance the consumer welfare and then rein in the power of the big tech giants. But then others would look at that, look, there are actually elements of the state-driven model, a lot of data localization. There's a conversation whether India is purely a democracy, how content is being moderated, especially under the existing government. So, and one question is, well, maybe India is not just a hybrid, but it has these own intrinsic characteristics, including the DPI, which might become kind of a fourth model, something that is an alternative in the global south, if you want to use the term, to follow and align itself with a larger economy that is not China and that is not the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to say, I see some questions starting to come in. We're going to talk for another, I don't know, 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to start looking into some audience questions. So please post your questions in the chat box next to your YouTube screen. Thank you to those of you who have already posted questions. Just staying on this idea of other countries, and you know, there's the big empires, and then there's what I call the geopolitical swing states. I mean, that's not my term, but I just use that. What about the smaller countries? Like, how do they fit into all this? Is their fate essentially, you know, that their terrains to be contested by the big empires? Do they just end up aligning themselves with one of the empires? What happens to small countries that don't have capacity, that don't necessarily have data?
Yeah, so I think some of these countries now find themselves in looking at what do they need the most. And if you look at many, for instance, developing countries in Africa, what is a priority for them is not necessarily data protection and all those rights that the Europeans are championing as being a key to a digital society. But it's really that they say we need a path to digital development. And then who do they turn to? Well, China is providing absolutely vital digital infrastructure that is pretty good and that is affordable. So they often find themselves then receiving the Chinese digital infrastructure, and with that, the presence of the Chinese tech companies that then provide the kind of technological development that is consistent and compatible with the infrastructure, the digital backbone that is now provided by China. Mm-hmm. So there's whether it's a alignment with China or being sort of part of the Chinese digital sphere of influence by choice or by necessity or by practical considerations, we see that. And the US and the EU are really struggling then to make inroads in many of those countries and say that, look, we want to convince these countries to reject the Chinese infrastructure, but it's very hard to do unless you provide an alternative. And in many of those markets, there has not been a proper alternative. So this is one reason why China is doing very well in many parts of Latin America and in Africa. Also, if we think about the broader geopolitical trends, the world is turning more authoritarian. It is not that there's this master plan from Beijing to blanket the world with surveillance without there being a demand for it. No, the demand is there. There are many governments that are either authoritarian or increasingly authoritarian leaning, and they welcome and actively solicit the kind of infrastructure that China can provide, including with guidance on how you manage the information environment. So when they look to the European model, it's not that they want to maximize democracy and fundamental rights. They look at China and they like what they see. So that's certainly one thing, but that's not to say that the entire developing world is aligning with China. I think there are elements, there's still countries that trade and have political dependencies, deep alliances with the United States. So obviously the US is not without influence there. There are countries that have had a lot of historical, cultural, colonial relationship with the EU. So there's still a very robust conversation in terms of looking at the EU laws as a model and starting to draft laws with those laws in mind. It helps the EU too, that the laws, everything exists in multiple languages. So in French for Francophone Africa, in Spanish and Portuguese. So it's easier to plug in the models that come from Europe when they are already existing in the languages. So there are sometimes even pragmatic reasons why you see the Brussels effect take hold in some of those markets where the legislation at least still follows often the templates that these countries are familiar with.
Yeah, well, I could talk about this a lot longer, but I feel I would love to have an entire conversation without mentioning AI once, but I think we probably can't, right? So I should probably, before handing over to the audience, I should probably ask you on the topic of digital sovereignty. There's calls these days for AI sovereignty, and just more generally how you see the kind of AI landscape evolving. Is it just a continuation of what you've already written about, or does it have distinctive features?
So I think in many ways it fits very nicely with the three models. So if you look at the trends and how the empires are approaching AI revolution, you see many of the echoes of the prior choices by these jurisdictions in terms of other aspects of the digital economies. So unsurprisingly, the EU is the first one to regulate. The EU enacted its AI Act, which is the world's first comprehensive horizontal binding regulation on AI. That is very much consistent with what the EU has done in privacy, in content moderation, in competition, so antitrust, digital taxation. So that was probably expected. And what is motivating this law is this keen awareness of the need to protect the individuals and societies for various harms associated with AI, while at the same time trying to strike a balance, because the EU also cannot afford to forego the benefits associated with the AI. The US is interesting because in many ways the US is shifting. There is an increasing consensus of the harms around AI. So there is a conversation now that we do need to mitigate those downsides. There's now a really, I would say, an ambitious but very contested bill in California that the governor of California needs to decide if he signs that into law, which would make California a frontrunner in the US with binding laws that restricts, especially the kind of more existential or the severe risk associated with frontier models. We also have the executive order from President Biden that lays out many of the same values that the European that are motivating the European AI Act, but it's still very much true to the American market-driven instincts. It's mainly voluntary. It's full of guidelines. So ultimately, it's nowhere close to as robust compared to what the EU is offering. So in that sense, it still fits to that market-driven model. AI for the Chinese government, if you think about the two things China wants to maximize, one is its technological sovereignty. It wants to become a technological superpower. That's not going to happen unless the country leads in AI. And it's investing heavily in AI. But also then if you think about this desire to maintain control, including then sort of broader the pursuit of social harmony in the country, AI is kind of a double-edged sword. It can help the Chinese government carry out very effective surveillance. AI-driven facial recognition is a beautiful tool for that. But then if you think about the country's commitment to censorship, AI and especially generative AI models that can take a life of their own, and if you don't control the output or how you train those models, that can then undermine the message that is shaping the conversations in China. And the Communist Party cannot afford that. So China has also regulated AI to ensure then that AI doesn't undermine that censorship regime. So that again, I think it just shows rather that AI fits into those models, but what it does, it further elevates the stakes and the sort of the degree of geopolitical competition and the clashes between the empires when their different values are colliding.
Right, thanks. Okay, I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to turn to some audience questions here. Let's see, somebody asked about India. We've already kind of discussed that. All right, here's one related to kind of current events question from Anonymous. What do you think of the US ban on TikTok and TikTok's attempt to challenge it on First Amendment grounds in US courts?
So that's a fabulous question as well. So thank you for that. This is another example when I mentioned that the US doesn't seem to be any more fully committed to the market-driven model. The TikTok ban is, many would say, an element of censorship. So that is, Americans want to use that platform, but the government is uncomfortable about TikTok. And there's two reasons for that. So one is the risk or the fear that because TikTok has a Chinese parent and there's a sort of opaqueness on what is the relationship between Chinese companies and Chinese government, that the data from all those Americans, so 100 million of them that are using TikTok, would end up in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and the informational advantage that they would have on Americans based on that. But the second is that whether TikTok becomes a tool for propaganda, and those algorithms would be shaped by some of the priorities of the Communist Party. So that is motivating then the US to pursue the banning of TikTok. But it also shows how asymmetrical these battles are. TikTok is now fully deploying the rule of law and independent courts in the US, and it's challenging those bans exactly by you justifying what is at the heart of the market-driven model and the US's commitment to free speech. And TikTok is asking the courts to then uphold that free speech and then find it unconstitutional to ban the company. So I think that is a really interesting contrast, because the ability of the American companies to take the Chinese government to Chinese courts and challenge the various bans have prevented the US companies from tapping into the US market. So there is no Google search that you can conduct in China. Meta's Facebook is not available in China. X is not available there. But the US companies cannot deploy the Chinese court system to their advantage. The Chinese companies like TikTok are doing that, which means it's much harder for the US to actually effectively ban ban TikTok. But let me say one thing, what I think the US should do rather in this instance is that I think this is yet another reason why the US would be better off with a federal privacy law, a robust privacy law that would create a much greater foundation for the US to control how data is collected, how data is used. And that would then also help the US not to go after a Chinese company that singles out, but really sort of hold on to companies, including its own, to the practices around data gathering that would be then consistent with that legal framework.
Yeah, and I've also thought that might help the US's foreign policy interest, because it would reduce suspicion of big tech, right? Like part of the resistance to the US model is not resistance to US government, it's resistance to the habits and practices of its companies.
Absolutely.
So okay, couple more questions here. Oh, we got a lot of questions. Okay. Question from Ken Zida. Can you envision any bright spots for collaboration between the empires on digital policy?
So absolutely. I think there's a lot of incentives to try to hold on to whatever benefits we can hold on to of the global digital economy, and that is a strong incentive for collaboration. Tech companies want to be able to operate globally. They continue to lobby their government against these restrictions, and the governments cannot fully afford to ignore those companies. So I think there are commercial realities that push the countries towards de-escalation, that create some space for what I would call islands of agreement. So even if there's not a broader, comprehensive collaboration, that there would still be some victories that can be achieved by having collaboration. Let me just say maybe a few words on AI, because that's where the efforts are very much underway. So I don't think we are going to have a global AI treaty, big, ambitious, binding, the UN Charter type of treaty that would be particularly meaningful and deep. I think there are too many disagreements among the countries. Yet we have the UN very actively sort of fostering conversations around this. It has its own advisory board and an attempt to bring the countries closer. We see also other fora, including whether it's G7 that is going deeper, or the OECD, more among the like-minded countries, or then the UK hosting this global summit that became hopefully one of the many, where the countries come together, including US and China being in the same room and trying to see where they can agree. So for instance, in AI, I think we can think about two aspects. One is that we think about risks, and the other one we think about rights. The rights question is much more polarizing, because that's about values. And there's not going to be a global agreement on what we do, for instance, with AI-powered mass surveillance. But issues around risks, where we can think about those as a more technical level, more scientific level, I see a lot of scope for collaboration among various national AI safety institutes. Some of those are already along the way. Both the US and China have a strong incentive to prevent bad actors from gaining access to AI and weaponizing that AI then in a way that kind of causes a sort of bigger threat to humanity. That's no longer the question of whether you're authoritarian or democratic. That's not an ideology that would be setting them apart. I think they have a joint interest there. So the same way we still try to make progress on climate change, there are some threats that are common and that are not ideological. And I think we need to fully embrace that. And one aspect is kind of the military AI. We talked a little bit about this national security-driven competition. Even at the height of the Cold War, there were arms control treaties between the Soviets and the United States. So I think for the most existential risks and autonomous weapons, where really the global security is fundamentally at risk from escalation, I really hope that we see some progress in the US and the EU coming together the way the adversaries have in the past, to try to agree on some common rules on how we make sure that things don't escalate to a point where everybody's life is at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm looking at this. This is an interesting question. Again, from Anonymous. Do you think that the EU would regulate AI differently if EU countries were at the forefront of technological innovation in AI?
So this is a really good question, because there's a very common sort of perception of the EU as being, to some extent, protectionist regulator, that all these cases against US companies is just this kind of envy-driven attempt to give the fleeting European companies a leg up because they can't compete on merits. And I understand where this idea comes from, that it's obviously easier to regulate the companies that are not European. You don't get the full economic benefit of their success, and you don't fully internalize the cost when you regulate them. They don't politically punish you the same way that the US government would if it ignored the tech lobby in the US. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that there are deeper and very genuine concerns that the Europeans have about the power of big tech. It is not just in the tech where the Europeans are behaving this way. There is a greater faith in markets being imperfect and failing, and a greater trust in government intervening. And there's a longer tradition also in using competition law, for instance, as a tool to advance consumer welfare. So I don't think there's a reason that why the EU is going after American tech companies. because they're American. They happen to be the biggest companies with also the biggest risks and problems associated with the abuse of their market power, with their way of exploiting the commercial data, their consumers' data for the commercial purposes, and they are at the forefront of AI development. So yes, to some extent, these concerns are European concerns that are not just the concerns about European competitiveness. But that said, we saw at the very final stretches of negotiating the AI Act how China got, I'm sorry, let me take that back, how France got very cautious because French AI company Mistral now suddenly seem to have had the potential to break in and make a difference and really do well in the AI race. And now China, at that point, France was very worried about then restricting the ability of Mistral to pursue its innovations. So it's not, especially in today's environment, where the geopolitical competition is very intense, where the pressures towards protectionism and industrial policy are intensifying, it's not surprising that there are voices in Europe that are very eager to boost European competitiveness, including European national champions. So my short answer to your very good question is that I don't think that's the only motivation, but I cannot fully exclude. And my fear is that those kind of considerations are gaining in importance in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad I was going to come back to you and ask you about Mistral, because that episode, it does sort of back up the implicit premise of the question, right? There was a kind of backing away from regulation.
Yeah.
But I just want to ask you another follow-up question about the EU and AI regulation, which is, do you think that EU AI regulation will have the same Brussels effect as GDPR did? Or was GDPR really like, it was first in its class and that's why it had that kind of demonstration effect?
Yeah, so I think in many ways the AI Act is already having some degree of the Brussels effect, but I think it may be incomplete. So first of all, AI is so multifaceted. And I think the effects of regulating AI are going to be different depending on the setting in which you are seeking to regulate AI. So there is certainly a global conversation right now where almost every government needs to ask the question, how do we govern AI? There's very little now traction to this idea that we can totally leave this to the tech companies and governments don't need to get involved. So when the governments start regulating, the question is, where do they look at? They don't necessarily start from scratch. And the EU has provided now a very comprehensive framework for regulating. So most likely we are going to see some governments emulate aspects of the EU regulation. Then we see also global companies adjusting their product development, their development of AI systems to the EU's AI Act, at least if they continue to operate in the EU. And there the main question is, will they then extend those adjustments outside of the EU as well? And I don't think there's going to be a single answer. I think they're going to make the cost-benefit calculus where it is not that expensive for them ultimately to comply with the EU rules, or there are reputational benefits of extending those same kinds of protections to other places. So if you think about, for instance, that the EU really sets higher requirements on how you make sure that you have unbiased data sets and how do you use, for instance, AI to screen applicants for employment, or you screen then sort of who is eligible for loan. So you use it for credit to measure credit worthiness. If a bank or if any HR department then goes through the pains to make sure that the AI is as unbiased as possible, I would have a hard time in believing that they would not then use that unbiased AI model in other branches to make sure that their recruitment is not vulnerable to biases in other markets, or that their credit worthiness determinations would potentially lead to discrimination. I think there's going to be that some of those investments the companies realize will be not just to comply with the law, but actually lead to more consumer trust in other markets as well, better quality AI, less vulnerability for future regulatory challenges, and sometimes just in anticipation that other regulators will be following the EU potentially and holding them to those standards in other markets as well. So that's, I would say, that we are going to see most likely some degree of the Brussels effect, but given the the many forms of AI and the multiple decisions that different companies make in different markets, I don't think we are going to see complete Brussels effect emerge across the board.
Yeah, I guess I just felt that sort of in addition to providing, so GDPR, in addition to providing a kind of template and then, making countries that wanted to access the EU having to comply, it also had this incredibly powerful demonstration effect, right? It was the first time that regulators said, what do you mean we can't regulate the internet? We're doing it right here. We're a liberal democracy and we're doing it. Watch us do it. We're going to find these companies. And with AI, it's a very different landscape because there's basically consensus that it can be regulated, it should be regulated.
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly a first mover advantage.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
when the EU moved with the GDPR, there was a tipping point after which it seemed like the entire world was converging behind that standard, and it would be very hard to reverse that. I think it's right that there are now many more attempts to find the right way to regulate. So the EU may not necessarily have the same kind of advantage of going ahead before the others so far along that it would be able to capitalize fully on that first mover advantage. But that said, if you compare what is happening around the world, there are very few examples that are as ambitious, as comprehensive, and ultimately many would say, this is a normative statement, but rather balanced. It is still, many would say that they are comfortable with the idea that this is a risk-based regulation. All AI is not dangerous. We really need to focus on trying to understand what type of AI applications pose those risks, focus our regulatory efforts those lists. And when the countries have that kind of conversation, the lists that the EU has compiled on which types of AI falls into which categories, they are going to look at that. And I expect there to be some degree of overlap. But it is true that there's also some changes that are very likely because of the other sort of domestic intricacies that feed into any legislative process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have about 8 minutes left, and I'm going to try to get through a couple more questions. If any of you out there want to post any last questions, now would be the time to do it. So this sort of feeds from what we were just talking. Somebody asks, could you comment on what you think the ultimate impact of new EU regulatory actions will have on American big tech firms? For instance, will behavior and businesses meaningfully change? Will firms exit or limit their offerings in the EU, or will something else happen?
So this is great because if you look at now the fury of activity from Brussels that are restraining the company's ability to conduct the business as usual. So what is really remarkable, and especially those who haven't followed in detail how the sort of the EU's regulatory agenda has shifted. So the EU is now increasingly conscious that all the regulations that it has had in place just have not been enough. That there's been 10 billion in fines against Google, yet nothing has happened to Google market share. So the EU realizes that fines are no longer sufficient. These processes, investigations take too long, so they need new tools. And now they have been given new tools. So there's the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, that then are designed to let the public authorities intervene more quickly and more effectively. And there's going to be a set of changes to the very business models that these companies need to be making, else they are going to face significant sanctions. So the EU is now going at the very heart of how the App Store operates, how Google is ranking its search results, how we need to have interoperability, meaning that you would need to have Meta ensure that WhatsApp will receive messages from Signal. Yes, it sounds radical, but I think none of us would think that why shouldn't Akash and I have a conversation even if you have a Verizon phone and I have an AT&T? Yes, our phones need to be interoperable. So there's going to be a lot of changes that are now going to have to take place for these companies to be in compliance with EU laws. So the next couple of years will really show us, it will be revealing on whether this new approach to tech regulation will actually be effective. Because now there are much more robust tools. And now the question is how effectively the EU can deploy them. But that said, we've had a lot of issues with enforcement. I think there are legitimate concerns how easy it will be to actually implement the very ambitious AI Act. So there's going to be a lot will be at stake in terms of the legitimacy of the entire European regulatory project and its model, because if you cannot entrench that into concrete market outcomes. Any victory that the EU could claim by saying our model is increasingly popular, it's a hollow victory, because in practice, it's the American market-driven model that would prevail. Let me just take one, because it was a very interesting part of the question, is that will we actually see that the tech companies abandon the European market because the regulations are too costly? And we've now seen some of the leading tech companies delay the AI features from the EU market because they believe that they are not in compliance and they just cannot and don't want to bear those compliance costs. This happened already earlier, so it's not the first time they are threatening of abandoning the European market, but let me give you a couple of reasons why it's very difficult for them to do so. So you remember when Meta launched Threads, which was supposed to be a big competitor to X, it didn't launch it in the EU at first when it said we just can't, it's too costly for us to comply. And there was a sense that now Europeans are going to be deprived of this fantastic new tool, and they're going to probably pressure their regulators to change course. But I think for three reasons, it's very difficult for these companies to abandon the European market. So for companies like Meta and for the tools that still rely on advertising, where do they go if they abandon the European market? So it's not that they go to China. That market is not open for them. They might go to India, and it is the biggest market right now for Facebook, for instance. But as long as your revenue depends on advertising, per user advertising revenue is so much lower in India than it is in Europe. So you need to pick up a lot of users in other parts of the world to make up for the lost advertising revenue in developed markets like Europe. And the third issue, this is no longer a mission for European regulators alone. At some point, these companies realize that the net is tightening. If it's Australia, if it's Canada, if it's Korea, if it's Japan, there's going to be a lot of markets that they cannot operate in if they want to have it their way. Even now we're seeing shifts in the US, where we have a historical, very significant court ruling now that looks like the judiciary in the US is rethinking the reach of US antitrust laws and potentially also then more effectively holding the big tech accountable. So I think that tech companies need to pick their battles. They cannot fight every law in every jurisdiction, which is likely to lead to some degree of voluntary compliance. But I don't think the battles are over. The stakes are too big, the profits are too alluring that we will see them fight selectively some battles, but they will fight some of those battles to the end. So that means that the regulators also need to be very vigilant and very prepared to defend the regulatory choices that they are reaching in the name of democracy, in the name of their society, and the kind of values that are now that are embedded in those regulations.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a question about the kind of nitty-gritty of policymaking that comes to mind here. I mean, we talked earlier about how, tech policy used to be very arcane, but now it's kind of like the stuff of everyday life. Nonetheless, the stuff we're talking about here is highly specialized and requires highly kind of expert knowledge. And, you just talked about the difficulties of enforcement that the EU has faced. How are you seeing the availability of expert knowledge to policymakers? Is there like a shortage? Is there a bottleneck? I mean, like experts like you are teaching in Colombia, right? Like you're not actually sitting in Brussels right now regulating. Is that an issue for the EU or just more generally?
I think it is an issue. I think definitely the regulatory capacity. One question is resources. You are battling companies that are just so well resourced to wage these legal battles. They know the technology and they have the lawyers to engage in a very robust defense. So partially it's the question of resources, but also, like you say, expertise. And the big challenge for the EU right now, for instance, is to staff those agencies in charge of implementing the EU's AI Act. They need to understand data science. They need to understand how technology works. So it is a challenge, but let me just end with this one, is that it's often deployed by tech companies, this argument, as an argument against regulation. They say you should not be regulating AI because the legislators don't understand AI. I am not sympathetic to this argument. So we have lawmakers regulate many domains of economic activity where they are not experts. We, I think, all accept that we regulate airline safety. Our legislators don't know how to build airplanes. We all accept that we regulate medicines, vaccines, even though our lawmakers don't know how to develop those vaccines. The same thing about, for instance, artificial intelligence. Yes, our lawmakers don't understand how to build some of those models. But this is also not just about technology. This is also about how technology like AI affects democracy and fundamental rights. And these companies are not experts on democracy and fundamental rights. That's not the expertise of Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman. That's why we do need to have the regulators as the main deciders, as the main governors. But because of that expertise gap, there needs to be a conversation between the developers of technology and those who regulate technology. But ultimately, I think we need to understand that the key societal decision on regulation are not left for companies, but ultimately it is the job of the governments.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that's a great place to end. That ultimately these are actually social choices, and they involve really complicated trade-offs between what philosophers call incommensurate values, and those, as you say, are not decisions for technologists to make, but ultimately for the democratic process to make. So I agree with that. We are at time, and I'm going to run a tight ship here and say that we're going to end exactly on time. So thank you, Anu, for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hope we'll continue the conversation in other ways. Thank you to the audience for joining and for all your questions. I hope you had as much fun as I did.
This was great, Akash. Thank you for terrific questions. The same to the audience. Really wonderful conversation.